Good evening, everybody. My name is Pat Berry. I happen to be, is this on? Can you hear me? Can you hear me now? Okay. Again, good evening, everybody. My name is Pat Berry. I happen to be the city attorney. Ken Fesick, the Plan Committee Chair, happens to be sick today. We learned this morning, so we're going to have to move forward and conduct the meeting in his absence. So the first thing I would like to do is have the clerk call the roll to call the meeting to order.
Carrico? Vidigar?
Here.
Young?
Here.
Watson? Here. Weiner?
Here.
Minty?
Here.
Fesick? Peters?
Here.
Greening? Partridge?
Here.
Arthur?
Here.
So we have a quorum. Next is the Pledge of Allegiance, please. If you'd all stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So in Ken's absence, the first item of business tonight is to appoint a chair for this meeting to fill in for him. So do I have a nomination for a chair from the membership?
I will make a motion to nominate Vice Chair Kyle Vidigar.
Do I have a second to that?
I'll second.
Karen? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposition? Kyle will be recognized as the chair for tonight's meeting. If you'd like to come forward, Kyle.
All right, thank you, Pat. Like Pat said, my name is Kyle Vidigar, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Planning Commission. So welcome to the Oglesby Elks. We want to thank this venue for having us tonight. It would have been an awfully tight squeeze in a city hall. So as you all are probably aware, we have an upcoming referendum on April 1st ballot, and that is to propose a change of government to the city manager form. With that, we wanted to host, or the city council commission, the planning commission, to host informational meetings. So I have some remarks here from Chairman Fesick, and he did such a thorough job that I'm going to read them. Again, welcome, and we thank the Elks for making the hall available for the meeting, the Parks Department, and the City Clerk's office for the arrangements. Several comments before we start on the conduct of the meeting. All or any comments must be non-personal, civil, and in good taste. Anything out of line, judged by the chair, will be addressed, and if needed, that person may be asked to leave. We are going to try to hold the meeting time to 2 hours. After the presentations, the floor will be open for questions of the speakers, first by the Plan Commission members, and then by the general public. If we don't get to all the questions tonight, there will be an opportunity to get the questions answered at the next meetings. Please direct the questions to the speakers on matters related to pros and cons of the issues. There will be opportunity for public comments later and at the next meeting. The issue in question on the Oglesby ballot is not to change the form of government, but to change from our current commissioner form to city manager form. In a little over 2 months, Oglesby voters will be asked if they want to adopt the council city manager form of government. The petition that was filed has met all the legal requirements and will be on the ballot on April 1st. Why is the Plan Commission involved? The Plan Commission is an advisory board to the council on matters concerning the growth and development of the city. The question of reviewing the forms of government was first brought up in 2009 in the Oglesby Comprehensive Plan. It was discussed again in 2013, but no directive came from the council or others for discussion or recommendation. The matter was not included in the 2019 Comprehensive Plan adopted by the council. We, the Plan Commission, are not now being asked to make an advisory recommendation because this matter is not in the hands of the council, whom we advise, but is now in the hands of you, the people, you, the voters. The Plan Commission has been requested by the council to present information to the voters on the issue of commission versus city manager forms of government so that the voters can make an informed decision in the voting booth. We ask you to keep an open mind. You can disagree with another's position, but everybody is entitled to his or her opinion. And that doesn't make anyone right or wrong, just that they have different viewpoints, and that has to be respected. So please be respectful. Just a bit of history, and we'll move on with the program. Oglesby was incorporated as Portland back in 1902 under the mayor-alderman form of government. There was a mayor and 3 wards, each represented by an alderman. Another ward was added when the city name changed to Oglesby in 1913. In 1919, the city of Oglesby adopted the commissioner form of government. In 1926, there was a question about the advantages and effectiveness of the commission form, and I haven't found out whether that was back to the aldermanic or some other form. No change was made. So for 106 years, Oglesby has operated under the commissioner form. Now we are being asked whether we want to change to the city manager form of government. We are having this meeting to try and understand what that change would mean, how it would affect the operation of the city, and why it might be more effective than our current form. We have invited speakers from various organizations associated with municipal government to present information on the pros and cons of the proposed change. So at this time, and I forgot my bio, excuse me. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Scot Wrighton. Chicago native Scot Wrighton is an independent governance consultant, trainer, and occasional author. His career is dedicated to resourceful public management and effective governance. He holds a bachelor's degree in history and government from Sterling College in Sterling, Kansas, a master's degree in history from the University of Hawaii, and a master's in public administration, city management from the University of Kansas. He has worked in the field of government management for more than 40 years in Kansas, Georgia, Missouri, the Republic of India, and Illinois. More than 30 of these years as a city manager. Wrighton's consulting specialties include strategic planning, organizational development, executive coaching, designing and implementing governance and structural change, teaching government ethics, concepts and strategies, and local government performance management and measurement. From 2003 to 2009, Scott served on the faculty of the University of Georgia's Carl Vinson Institute of Government. In this capacity, he taught government courses and provided local governance consulting services to elected and appointed officials in the United States and abroad. From 2009 until 2014, Scott served as city manager of new private city built from scratch in Maharashtra, India. It was intended to serve as a model of how new urban areas can be created and governed in South Asia as a response to the rapid urbanization of India. From 2014 to 2019, Scott served as city manager of Streator, Illinois, and from 2019 to 2024, he was city manager of Decatur, Illinois. Scott has published several articles and a book on effective local government supervision. Most of his publications concern the management, governance, and sustainable development of this public sector. In 2023, authored and published Article 5, Repairing American Government Amid Debilitating Partisan Strife. Please welcome Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd have preferred, here's a man who needs no introduction, so he's not going to get one, Scott. But that's what they wanted to do, is that long bio. I've worked in city management for many years, also taught others how to do it, and worked overseas as well. And from that experience, and this is really how I want to start this presentation this evening, from that experience, I will tell you that it's been my experience that regardless of the form of government that a local government uses, if everybody gets along, if everybody's on the same page, and they're all working on behalf of whatever the city's objectives are, its strategic plan is. If we're all one big happy family moving in the same direction, it doesn't matter what the form of government is. You can work with any kind of form of government, and believe me, working in India and the South, I've seen them all. If everybody's together, we just find a way to work it out. But that's not always how it works out, because not everybody's on the same page. And so ultimately what the evaluation becomes is, okay, since sadly, not everybody's always on the same page, not everybody's working together with a big group hug, when that's not the case, which form of government provides the best safety net? Which one buffers the delivery of local services so that citizens don't suffer from whatever dysfunction might be happening at the governing body level or at the local level? And that's really the question that I think is being put before you, stated in a different way, because if everybody's together, the form works just fine. So here in Illinois, the Illinois Constitution of 1970, which is the fourth constitution that Illinois has had and the one we currently operate under, and Illinois statutes called the Municipal Code, provide that although there are more than 3 forms of government in the United States, and you're going to hear my colleague talk about some of them, under Illinois law you can only have one of 3. The commission form, which you have now, where the members of the city commission are also elected as department heads to supervise their division, their department, or whatever, their sector of the local government. The strong mayor aldermanic form, which is not a consideration here in Oglesby, but it's where the elected mayor is both the head of the city council, in other words, head of the legislative part of government, and simultaneously the executive of the government. In other words, he supervises the departments as well. So both the service delivery, the administration, and the legislative piece, the policy-making piece, are both under the mayor. The city of Chicago is a somewhat, more than somewhat, corrupt form of strong mayor aldermanic form of government. The vast majority of the suburbs around Chicago in the 6-county metropolitan area operate under the third form, which is the council manager form. So you have to have one of these 3, and to go from one to the other, regardless of which one you're going to or from, requires under Illinois law that you conduct a referendum. So the fundamental difference between the 3, and to make it really simple, is that in the strong mayor aldermanic form, all of the power, if that's the right word, of the administration of government is concentrated in the mayor. He has to go to the city council for major policy changes and big decisions, but day-to-day management of the city as well as the running of city council meetings all rests with a strong mayor. In the council manager form, the legislative function is separated some more from the administrative form. So in the council manager form, you still have a mayor. The mayor is the chief spokesman of the city, the chief policy maker of the city, and directs the long-range strategic planning of the city council. I mean, that's what I think most citizens really elect their elected officials to do, is to make sure that the city in 5 years, 10 years is a better city than it was now, and that some of these changes take place, and then leave the day-to-day administration and the execution of policy decisions enacted by the city council to a person who's trained to run these multi-million-dollar organizations that we call cities. So in the council manager form, that power is more dispersed. You know, our founding fathers pushed off an abuse of power called King George III, and so they were very attentive to making sure that the forms of government they replaced it with had dispersed power so that no one person had too much power. And the council manager form of government is one way of doing that, where the legislative power rests with the elected city council. They hire a manager, and the manager simply executes the policies of the council. The commission form arguably disperses power too, in a sense, because the 5 divisions of the departments and service delivery are dispersed between those 5 members of the city council. But it is the least popular of forms of government, in part because it's somewhat, that dispersal can mean that there's a failure to get along sometimes. Does anybody know what the most highest fatality natural disaster in American history was? It was the hurricane that struck Galveston, Texas in September of 1900. That was before they had seawalls and before we had the National Weather Service to tell us that deadly storms were coming. And it came ashore on Galveston, which is an island, just south of Houston, and 3,500 people died in a couple of days. Galveston had a commission form of government. That tragedy was bad enough, but in the weeks and months that followed that disaster, the city commission members couldn't get along and fought over what the recovery effort should look like, and the death toll got higher as a result of that. It was a tragedy, and the total death count ended up being closer to 6,000. And after all of that recovery was completed, the citizens said, we don't want to repeat this dysfunction, and it became one of the first city manager cities in the United States. Galveston, Texas is still run by a city manager form of government. Maybe a little bit closer to home, in 1986, just down the road and here in LaSalle County, the city of Streator had been operating under a commission form of government for many, many years. Unfortunately, during that time, two of the council members had been pulled up on felonies, and one of them went to jail for taking bribes and kickbacks. They had run the budget into the ground, and the local Ace Hardware downtown had to have cash on the barrel to give any supplies to the Public Works Department. The city, which is about 70% undermined by shallow coal mines, had been used as the place where they dumped most of the sewage rather than sending it to the sewage treatment plant. And for more than 4 years, the city council had not been able to make decisions, and it was 2-2 most of the time because they couldn't even agree on how to fill a vacancy. And so the city manager reform was put on the ballot in November of 1986. I'm not sure that the citizens knew what they were voting for, but they said, I'm not sure what it is, but it's got to be better than this mess we have now, and they adopted the form of government. I was hired as their first city manager. I was there for 7 years and then left, came back 20 years later and was city manager again for 4 years. During that, in the period of time that Streator has had the city manager form of government, there have been 2 referendums to go back to the commission form of government. Both of them have been rejected by the same 32 to 68% electoral majority that the referendum was first adopted on by 1986. I think that's because the citizens saw that even though that community had its struggles with losing industry, that it brought order, it eliminated the chaos, that the city saw $40 million in new grants to fix their sewer plant and lots of other grants, and an efficiency that was established there through that form of government. When I first took the job, the very first time in Streator, the media asked me, Scott, what is your agenda for the city? I said, my agenda is the city council's agenda. A city manager doesn't come in with an agenda. We serve at the pleasure of the elected city council, and can be fired by the city council if we fail to enact what a majority of the city council wants to do. That was the right answer for public consumption. The real answer is that most city managers do have an agenda, but that agenda is efficient and effective management of the city, in whatever direction the city council elects to take it. So the way the rest of the session is going to work is that now that I'm retired from being in city management, I'm still active with my former colleagues and the association as a senior advisor, which means that I travel around the state of Illinois and actually some other states too, not only talking about council manager form, but also helping managers with whatever problems that they might have. And so I am here this evening representing the Illinois City County Management Association. Jason Grant, my colleague, is with a similar sounding organization called the International City County Management Association, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. It was founded more than 100 years ago to support not just city managers, but also to be a voice for good local governance in whatever ways our elected officials direct that it go. So because of that, I want to say that I know that there's been a couple of, while Jason and I are here to talk generally about the council manager form of government and what questions that you have, we've done, we followed a little bit of the local press on the meeting here and some of the issues that Oglesby is considering. So let me speak to two of those. The first is about the costs. Obviously, there's a cost to having a city manager. I will say in general that, generally speaking, that a city manager, if he or she is performing properly, will more than pay for themselves in grants, in efficiencies, in eliminating lost opportunities that I think a lot of communities miss sometimes when they don't have a manager, negotiating contracts and negotiating other things that have direct and indirect value to the city government. The other thing that I want to say is that if there is, hypothetically speaking, of course, if there is bickering or dysfunction on the part of the governing body within its ranks, does that mean that the city manager form will eliminate all of that? No. If people are going to be difficult, then they're going to be difficult. And a form of government can't change that. I'd be silly to stand up here and tell you that it would. But what I will say, and I think that Jason's presentation will illuminate this to a greater degree, it serves to buffer. Because the council manager form in all of its forms is trying to find at least consensus. As a city manager, I always sought consensus among my city council. Get to a unanimous vote. If we can't get to consensus, then we vote and majority rules. But oftentimes the form tends to try to push that just because of the way that it operates. That doesn't automatically eliminate somebody who's bound and determined to be difficult. That's left to the citizens to fix at the ballot box. But it buffers it, and I think it means that there is less disruption in service delivery, meaning the services that we provide to citizens every day in city services. So that's my introduction, and I'm going to turn it over now to Jason. And the way we're going to do this is he's going to go through a PowerPoint, which is not about Oglesby, it's about city management form of government in general. I will probably chime in here and there as Jason proceeds to provide additional color commentary that might relate to Illinois and some of the issues that we face here in Illinois, or based on my own experience. And at the end of that, we'll have Q&A, and I believe that the chairman is going to moderate the Q&A. Is that right? So with that, Jason. Keep your own loud.
All right, so again, I'm Jason Grant with the International City County Management Association. And so I'll talk really broadly, and I'll talk fairly quickly so we get to y'all's questions, is really what matters, right? So I'll just give some background, some context so people kind of understand what it is. ICCMA, we have about 14,000 members internationally, most are within the U.S., and they all work within local government. It is not the elected officials. It is primarily city county managers, department heads, folks who are administrators and managers within government. And our role is to figure out what are the best ways, the best practices to be able to manage local governments, city and counties, towns and villages, right? So as we go through it, I'll pull up some research that kind of highlights why do we advocate for a council manager form of government or for professional administration within government. It's largely because if you look at research, you look at what happens, it functions better, right? If it doesn't, we would shift if research could show something different. So we'll go through, and again, I'll go through it pretty quickly. The biggest thing to emphasize is that local government is about localized solutions, right? So the federal government, the state government, much larger issues they're dealing with, much broader, which may have some indirect impact, but very little direct impact on the communities. The local government is there to address what are the problems we're facing here today, whether that's roads, whether it's schools, whether it's parks, whatever the issues are, our quality of life is impacted by local government. And so we want to make sure that that local government addresses those issues and problems for us. as we look at it, there's no uniform structure. So one of the things, sometimes what happens in a lot of these issues when people are looking at what's the best form of government, they'll often start looking at other states. What do they do over here? What do we do over in this state? Understand every state is different. Your state code, your constitution dictates what you can do. So sometimes it's pretty hard to compare apples to apples across state boundaries, even within the state. Particularly when you have home rule and city charters, sometimes what you do within the state will be very, very different from city to city, right? So it always has a localized flair, and it is very much about what's happening in your community of what you want. It's important to recognize that it's a child of the state. The state constitution stipulates the 3 forms of government you can have, how those governments can operate. So you're limited in what you can do in terms of how you structure it. So within the confines of what the states allow, every state will look at those local communities, say, what are we allowed to do? How can we do it? And what makes the most sense for us? And I will echo the fact that any form of government can work, any form of government can fail. It is the people serving in government that do good or do harm to the community, right? And so what we look at is when we start talking about form of government, how do the people make certain there are what's best for us of what we're looking for, and how do we have some protections in the event that we have people who aren't maybe always looking out for the best interest in the community, right? Because it's great if everyone is doing what we want in the community, there's not a problem. It's when all of a sudden it's not working well that we start to say, is there something else? What are the risks? And so I'm going to talk about some of those risks and why certain forms of government may be more prone to certain types of risks than others. Again, not to say that it's going to stop or create any problems, right? The people will do that, but there's certain barriers to different issues that come up. I am not going to go through all the history of local government. I'll save you that issue, right? Biggest thing to understand is professional management came in the 20th century. It really came out of this issue of there's corruption happening in governments. Usually the partisan politics, the boss politics are coming into play. They're determining who gets to run for office. How do we make sure that the government administration actually has the ability to do the things that they're supposed to do? How do we make sure people are trained to actually know something about roads, know something about parks, knows how to run these issues? Running a business is sort of how it started, right? A business usually has a CEO that's hired by a board, and that board can fire them if they're not doing what the company needs them to do, if they're not meeting the goals, right? That's sort of how it started out. We'll have this city manager, they called it, who's going to manage this city, and they can be hired and fired by the board for how well they do their job. And that's sort of how that started coming out on it. So this professional management was a way to say we need some expertise in government as governments become more complex. And so the more complex that government comes, the more that you need some people who maybe been there before, done that, have some knowledge about how to do certain things so that we're more effective in what we do. And so within the U.S., these are the forms of government you'll normally see. Council manager is the most common, followed by mayor council, and then a huge drop-off when you get to commission. Town meeting is pretty much just in New England, by and large. It never changed since they came over, right? Everyone would meet in the church, they'd vote on who the sheriff's going to be or what they wanted to do, and they all went back home. They still kind of operate that way. They have a town meeting, everyone votes on one budget, they all go back home, right? So it's only in New England. Everyone else realized that's really not going to work for us. So primarily you're going to see council manager, mayor council, and commission as your primary forms of government at the local level. This I had is 10,000 to 25,000. This was on an earlier presentation. We pulled them together. Within your population size, it's pretty similar, but within Illinois, it is about 2% are at the commission form and 30% are at the council manager form. So still primarily council manager is more common in that. The commission, when commission came up, it was all the rage. And the idea was you used to have separate powers, right? So the mayor and the council, and they're separate, much like our state and local government. Local government started to say, this makes no sense. We all are in the same community. We all know the same problems. Why are we trying to separate these powers? We need to have them combined. That's what commission did. They took legislative powers, executive powers, put them all within the commission. And then they said, each of you run your departments within a commission structure and will be a lot more effective. We don't need to deliberate anything. You're going to run these 3 departments, you run this 2 departments, however that's structured. Those commissioners, they have control, they have executive powers over each of those independently in a traditional commission structure. made a lot of sense when they were tired of the deliberative process and they couldn't get things done. Then they realized, holy cow, we are not very efficient because you're arguing for 3 people, I'm arguing for 3 people, you want all the money going to this program, I want all the money to go into my program, let's make a deal. Everyone else not in those departments don't get what they want, and then we're not necessarily efficient because you have the same people I have that they could probably do the job more efficiently if we were actually working throughout as an organization. And that's where the city management came in, is to say, well, let's look at it holistically, let's look at the organization, and are we effective in what we do, right? So that's the way that those came up and came through. The manager versus an administrator in here, so we look at under the commission structure. So as you're administrating each one of these, they're generally political appointments under the commission form. Under the manager form, you would have generally a department head that they may hire to be able to run that, and it's based on their qualifications to actually do that job as opposed to simply elected. Under the manager, under council, they're responsible for effective, efficient operation of the entire government. And then under commission, it's each department. They're responsible for those departments to be effective. Under council manager serves equitable administration of government without political favor or bias. In the administration of the commission form of government, they carry out as directed by each commissioner, which they got elected for a certain reason. This is what we're doing within this structure, which may be different than another commissioner in the departments that they're running. They may not always be on the same page. No idea what's on here. This is just how it generally works within commission structures. And then under the council manager, obligated to faithfully and fully administer the government by the council, right? So council sets the policy. This is what we want. We want good ball fields. We want the roads to be good. We want whatever these program services that we want in our community. The council decides that. The manager has to bring those forth. If they don't, they can fire them at any time for failure to do the job. That's the way that it works, right? Under the commission form, the commissioner holds their staff that's under them accountable generally to try to deliver. Don't really care about the other programs and services. I'm here to run my departments. That's how you'll normally see it, which sometimes creates some departments are run well, some are not. Some get resourced, some don't, and there's not always agreement within the council because they don't really have to. The commission doesn't have to come together in agreement, big picture. If they don't want to, they can go back to their siloed areas of government. So this is where some of the challenges tend to come in around these two forms. On the research findings, so again, I won't read all the research to you. There is a bio in here if you really want to look at the research. So we look at what are some of the academic research. So these are people that are doing third-party, strictly academic research to say what works. And they usually compare council manager to mayor council, this combined and separate. And so you start to look at what is the value of council manager government? Why does it work or not work? How do these things differ? When you look at, if you have higher concentration of political administrative powers, you're more bureaucracy. And this is somewhat counterintuitive. People think of, oh, council manager, we can put some bureaucrat here to run stuff. We don't need more bureaucrats. It's usually what people hear. If you don't like bureaucracy, you'd want to shift to the council manager. It's actually less bureaucracy. And it makes sense for a little bit if you start to think about it. If I'm elected, I got to do constituent services. I got to get prepared for a campaign. I got to understand what I'm doing politically. And then, oh yeah, I also have this full-time job of running these departments. I don't have enough time to do all that. Usually what happens is they can't pass on doing the political stuff. They got to be out there kissing babies, hugging people, talking to people to get elected. So that is going to be the full-time job. The part-time job that ends up becoming how to run the departments, well, they'll create a bureaucracy. You take care of this, let me get a committee to do that. We'll pull some other people together for some other aspects of it. So that usually ends up becoming more bureaucratized than under council manager. Hey, we hired you to do this job. You got to make sure this stuff gets done. And so the research shows if you're looking to reduce bureaucracy, council manager works better. If you look at, you want to have cost savings, we spend too much money. Commission form historically, the reason, and I'll tell you, I've been working with ICCMA for 5 years, looking at forms of government and talking to communities. I have never in 5 years, and I went back and looked at it, have not seen in 15 years anybody wanting to go to commission form. And there's a reason. It costs a lot more money generally. It is one of the more wasteful because there's not a need. Again, not saying it always is, it can work. But generally, the problem is there's no need to work together, so you usually have duplicative services, and there's not a thought of how do we save money across the whole organization. And again, so no one shifts to commission form. They will shift to the council manager. And when you look at where is cost savings, they run lower costs, largely because that's one of the charges of a city manager. If you're a city manager and you're not efficient in what you do, the elected body is usually going to call that out pretty quickly, right? So usually that's a part of the job. They're more likely to have financial incentives that make sense from economic development. So if you want to do economic development, politically, usually you have, in cities, they're either 2 or 4 year terms. Most are on 4-year terms nationally. I'm not sure how you all run 4 years. Okay. So by the first year, I'm trying to figure out what the heck's going on here. How do I sign into my computer? How do we work stuff? What works in it? Second, third year, I'm getting stuff done. Fourth year, you're running for office, right? So you got 2 years of really getting a lot done to set up that final year of election. That's generally the way that the election cycle works. So when it comes to economic development, who's supporting a campaign may be a consideration, right? Hey, I can expedite this project because I know this person, I'm connected to that person, I can work that person in. The incentives may help for the immediate because it looks good, doesn't necessarily look long-term. City managers don't have to worry about each election cycle. Their goal is to say, does this incentive bring the types of jobs and investment that we want in the community? And if it will, then the investments we offer will show that return on investment through jobs and investment, as opposed to any other kinds of issues coming in. So when you look at the research, which one tends to offer incentives that work, council manager is more likely to have incentives that draws in the types of economic development they want. They usually have better budget solvency. Again, largely because that's generally something that you're always going to ask of a city manager, is some expertise, knowledge, experience running a multi-million-dollar budget and a multi-million-dollar government budget, which has certain earmarks, stipulations, nowhere to draw revenues from, whether it's state or federal funds. It's very different than running private government. All money is not fungible within government structures as it might be in a business structure. And they've also more likely to utilize sophisticated revenue forecasting, expenditure analysis techniques, prepare more long-term, long-range. That's usually the role of what you look at, is that long-term planning. They're less likely to have political corruption convictions, 57% less likely, right? So a lot of people are concerned about corruption in government. So when you look at which forms of government has the lowest amount of convictions, it's in the council manager form. If you're looking at making strategic plan guidance for economic development, council manager does better. If you're looking at how do we reduce the amount of political influence to make sure we have financial outcomes that are good, council manager shows better. And then if you look at the bond ratings like getting debt, right? So the better our bond rating, so rating agencies come out, so we're building any public projects, whether it's a school, whether it's a library, whether it's roads, if you're issuing a bond to build that capital debt project, the better your bond rating, the lower it costs you, so your money goes farther. Council manager governments tend to have higher bond ratings as well. And the council manager cities tend to be equipped with more advanced information systems. So the IT and technology they looked at, and again, because no one's ever won an election saying I'm going to have a good IT infrastructure. Never anything anyone will ever run on. A city manager, their jobs are dependent upon having that types of connectivity. So it makes sense that they're going to be more inclined to want to invest in those areas. So those are things, and you start to look at why would it work? Why would ICCMA advocate for council manager? It's because the data and all these things, we want to reduce corruption, we want to have better efficiency, we want to be more effective, we want to make sure things work better. The research keeps showing that it performs better. If it changes, we would change where that is, right? But so far, that's the way it's been for quite some time. On the issues that goes through, the administration politics dichotomy, you'll hear this discussion. There's a lot of debate often, well, is running a city a job? Is it a profession? Or do we get there by winning elections? And we try to separate this. And I'll be honest, you can't completely separate them, right? A city manager gets hired by an elected body of council. The majority of that council is going to set the agenda. And they're going to be asked, the city manager is going to be asked for recommendations. They will offer recommendations, which then become politicized, right? The politics will use it and say, hey, well, we got this recommendation from the city manager, so clearly it's a great idea, right? Or this is a horrible idea, this is why we need to fire the city manager, right? So there's always engaged in politics. But as we step through it, the goal is to say, how do we make sure the administration of government, giving the programs and services and delivering it, how do we reduce undue political influence on how that's administered and how those programs are delivered. And so that's often going to be a debate, and you may have questions on that, and we can talk to some of that. But that's always a question that comes up when it's about form of government is, what do we want our elected officials doing in decision making? What do we want the professionals in government doing and their decision-making, and that's always going to come to a debate of which form of government makes the most sense for a community. The other thing you want to look at is accountability. How do I hold them accountable? Right? And as voters, we can always hold people accountable at a voting box. It's hard for us to sometimes to grasp, how do we hold this city manager accountable? Right? 'Cause I didn't get a vote for them, so what the heck are they doing there? Well, the people you did vote for as a representative democracy, so that Republican structure of government says they hold them accountable. And so a city manager can be fired any day. If you happen to hire a commissioner that's not good at their job, you got to wait 4 years to hold them accountable. City manager isn't doing their job, they can be fired at any meeting that they come together and a majority says we want to get rid of this person. So it's a different way in which it's accountable, it's a different time frame in which they're held accountable. This issue of separate and unified powers we talked about a little bit. Commission form and council manager form both have the legislative and executive powers in the elected body. They hold both executive and the administrative powers. The difference is authority, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but they grant authority to a manager. The manager does not have power over the executive function of government, right? So they are not an unelected mayor, an unelected official overseeing government, because they can be fired any time. The power rests still with that council, with the commission. But the authority to do things, how we deliver it, that's what they grant to the city manager. The issue of corruption comes up a lot around these types of things. How do we reduce corruption? Again, I already talked about that it's 57% less likely to have corruption convictions than council manager. The reason why is corruption occurs when there's opportunity. If I, as an elected official, am the one who is overseeing the entire department and everybody works for me within a department, the opportunity for corruption is greater than if everybody has oversight, the entire council has oversight, other staff members underneath that city manager has oversight. Again, it's not to say corruption doesn't happen, it does, but you need to get all of council to agree to hire a manager and to have that manager who appoints professional staff. All of them have to be tied into wanting that corruption to occur. There's less silos in that regard. So it's not that it won't occur, it's the reason why is where the opportunities lie in each form of government. Partisanship, and sometimes it's political partisanship, sometimes it's partisanship within, we're all within the same party, but we're a different spectrum of where we see in that, and so I'm arguing for my own perspective, and I'm always going to hold my perspective, and that usually creates conflict, and so we're trying to figure out how do we make people work better, work together and collaborate within that elected body and within a community. If there's any divisions of we should do this and no, we should do that, and there's always these parties that form, not necessarily under political party banners, but it's very partisan in that way. So that discourse, how do we make sure that that comes together? Under council manager, because the manager is going to carry out the will of a majority of council, so they have to deliberate. That deliberative process of the council forces that conversation, and ultimately, so one of the questions is like, well, if they're just going to argue, they're just going to argue no matter what. Under council manager, eventually you say, we just call the question, and at some point we vote. And whatever majority is, that manager says, okay, that's the majority. And the manager maybe with the minority vote on the council in terms of what they would wish they would vote for. That happens, right? We have council members, they make a decision like, boy, I would have gone the other way, but they always make the right decision. It's the decision they do, and I have to carry it out as a city manager fully and faithfully. And so that's what I carry out. So if a council member comes to me and says, I don't think we should be doing this, we need to do that. Hey, look, I hear you. You need to get a majority of your council to agree. When you do, I can take action as a manager, we can shift that. But without that, I'm moving forward on what the majority of council did. So the ability to call the question and force action is what is different from commission to council manager structure. And then the representation always come up. How am I represented? The city manager works for the council and serves at the pleasure of the council and their majority, not each individual member. Right? They're responsive to each, but their action is based on that majority. And so the people do not directly hold that manager. They hold their council members responsible. If they don't feel the manager, the administration, the government is good, just like we do any other time we have problems, what's happened in the community, we go to them and we expect change, whether that's getting rid of a manager or making certain that manager starts delivering on the types of things we need to deliver on. I'm going to skip this part because we talked about that already. I want to lean into this a little bit more, power versus authority, because this comes up a lot, and it's an important distinction, right? Under power, when we describe who has power, is who has the capacity to control government actions, and it rests with the council under council manager form. It rests with the commission under the commission form. When we talk about the administration of government, we talk about the legislative. In both forms of government, your elected body holds that power. They're the ones who control government actions. Authority is what they grant to others in order to achieve the objective. So the little images here, right? You've got the king, and they grant to the knights to go carry out the will of the king, but the knights can't go do whatever the heck they want, right? So it's the same kind of idea. That authority that's granted is to say, look, we as a council are not going to tell you who you have to hire. We're not going to tell you how to accomplish this goal. That's totally your job. We grant you the authority to figure out how in the hell are we going to do what we're trying to do. But what we're not going to do is give you the power to do whatever the heck you want. You've got to carry out our will. And we as a council are going to decide what that will is. And it is your job to carry that out. The extent you carry it out, great. The extent you don't, we're going to have a different discussion, usually be in closed session under personnel matters, right? That's usually the way that that works out. So it's a huge distinction. You are not giving up any power to the manager, giving a lot of authority to the manager on how do we deliver these programs and services. There's a code of ethics that ICCMA members work by. This is different also from elected officials, right? So, and you don't have to hire an ICCMA member, right? So it's not to say that's where it is. You could hire anybody they want. But professional managers have a code of ethics. This is what we're supposed to, but one of those code of ethics is we don't engage in politics. We just don't, right? Like for me in local government, as Scott was saying, I never went to a single primary. My wife had a best friend running for office. Do not put a yard sign out there, right? We are nonpartisan. We don't take position. We should not take positions. We are not there to be political. We're there to build public trust and deliver on the strategic plan goals and priorities of the council, which they should be representing the people. So we serve the people through those adopted policies. We are not there in terms of politics. How it works, a manager is appointed by the majority of council. So just like any other job, they're going to advertise a job, people apply for it, you interview it, and different city managers have different backgrounds. What are you trying to accomplish? You want more economic development. We want better parks and rec facilities. We want better transportation. We want better public works. Whatever it is that we need as a community, that's what you look for. And then when you do an interview, it's based on merit. Like, have you done this? Do you show that you have the experience to do this? Do I think you're going to be effective for what we need in our community? And then they hire that person. They deliberate. Eventually, ideally, they hire them with a unanimous decision, so everyone's on board with hiring that person. Sometimes they don't, but then they hold them accountable for delivering. The hiring of staff, then, is the responsibility of the city manager, not the elected officials. Elected officials hire the city manager, then the city manager has to hire based on proven ability, not by political will, not by political influence, not because, hey, you're a good buddy of mine. They have to go through any other type of HR process to hire people into those positions and make sure that the staff has the ability to do what they're supposed to do. On the budget process, this gets confused a lot. Some people think the city manager runs, controls, and just puts forth the budget that gets rubber stamped by the commissioner of the council. What happens is you talk to the council. It should look like a rubber stamp because I should be talking to council. What do y'all want? What are you looking for out of this community? What's your strategic plan? What are your objectives? What are your goals? I should have all that dialogue and discussion. I offer a recommended budget. They can do whatever the heck they want with it, right? If I've talked to them, I've got what they've wanted on there. It shouldn't be some crazy deliberative process like I'm way off the mark. I should have most of that pretty well in what the council wants, and there be some things they change. But at the end of the day, I simply offer a recommendation to the council. They deliberate, they mark it up, they adopt the budget, and whatever budget they ultimately end up adopting, that's what I have to operate under as a city manager, right? So that process doesn't change, but what will change is the way that recommendation will be structured will be around what are the goals and objectives, what's the overall vision of the entire organization of government, what are all the programs and services, which are the priorities that you have seen now holistically. This is why I'm recommending it as I'm recommending it as a city manager, so that deliberative process becomes about, is this reaching the overall goals and objectives and priorities of the community based on the council's view? That's been discussed there. So the last things here, some of the key questions. Like, these are things that I would normally say, this is what I would ask if I'm debating between council manager and commission, some of the questions. One is, are organizations more successful with a chief executive officer responsible for directing staff, or multiple individuals offering potentially contrary direction? Under commission, each one of them control their departments and sometimes will step across departments. And staff, it's somewhat confusing sometimes. If you've got different commissioners, they're all elected, who do I listen to, particularly if it's contrary, right? If I have one city manager, they're saying this is the job, this is what we've got to do, that's the call. So it's clear, those lines of commands. That city manager will hear from every single one of the commissioners, but always act based on a majority decision. So like I said earlier, if you come to me and you're on the minority on the council, you've got to get to a majority for me to take action as a city manager to go that direction. And so those are sort of the questions we look at. Which one makes more sense? Which one functions better organizationally? Organization more successful with a chief executive officer accountable to the people on a daily basis, right? So the city manager responsible 24/7, 365, can be fired at any point in time. Elected officials once every 4 years is generally how you're held accountable, right? So which creates greater accountability? Do we value an executive officer with proven ability to run a city? Or do we value the ability to run a campaign to win the election, right? Those are two different backgrounds you have to show to get into that position. Should department heads be hired based on qualifications or political allegiance? Again, in commission form, there's not a requirement. Usually, they will hire people based on their abilities, but it's not a requirement of the form. Under the form of government council manager, it's a requirement to do it based on qualifications. And then the other key question here, do organizations thrive with consistent and effective service or with limited ability to advance one's career? Within the organization, commission forms tend to lose, as do mayor council forms, tend to lose quality staff, because eventually you come in, you're doing a job just like any of us who have a job. We're starting to get good at what we do. We have experience. If you're limited in your career growth, because once you get at department head levels, that's a political appointment, and I'm not a political creature, you'll usually go to cities or other organizations where I don't need to be political to advance a career, right? If I know I can work up to a department head position, if I know I can become a senior engineer, if I know I have those opportunities based on ability, not political allegiance, so more in staff tend to stay with council manager more than non-council manager structures. So I talked really fast because I know that y'all have a lot more questions that we can probably speak to directly, but want to just give that broad overview so you kind of understand where it comes from, what the research shows. But I'll turn it to Chairman and Scott. Yeah.
Thanks. I want to add before the chairman does some questions, just to sort of as a wrap up to some of the things that Jason said. He's a representative of the International City County Management Association. I represent the Illinois City County Management Association. But ultimately, although we like to talk about the advantages of the council manager form, ultimately what both organizations are about is good governance. How do we make our local governments operate better, provide services a little bit better? And the council manager form of government was a response to a critical time in our history when that was a serious problem. There's been a lot of discussion in the last few years about threats to democracy. Well, about 130, 140 years ago, it was a serious threat to democracy. Corruption was taking over our largest cities in New York and Buffalo. In fact, presidents like Grover Cleveland, the last non-consecutive, until Trump, his success came from saying no to corruption in Buffalo, and Theodore Roosevelt rose to prominence because of his resistance to corruption in New York City. And as a result of that huge amount of corruption that was going on in those places, the business community said, hey, we've got a solution, and it's the council manager form. Why don't you run cities like we run our businesses? Instead of having a board of directors, you have a city council. Instead of having a CEO who's responsible to that board of directors, you have a city manager. And that business approach to making governments run more efficiently, but still in the democratic realm, was what gave birth to our association. All my career, especially when I was overseas, people would ask me, what does a city manager do? And especially here in Illinois, the analogy is really pretty simple. It really is the same thing as what you all vote for in your school district. The citizens elect the Board of Education. The Board of Education hires a professional superintendent who runs the day-to-day affairs of the local government that you call the Oglesby School District. So it really is a very similar parallel, remarkably similar, at least in Illinois law. So I hope that provides a little bit more context and a capstone to what Jason said. Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to entertain whatever questions
Okay.
you have.
All right, thank you. So as a reminder, how the rest of this agenda is going to roll. First, we're going to have the commission ask any questions of the two gentlemen. And then we'll open it up to the public for questions for the gentleman as well. And then we have before we adjourn, we will have a period for public comment. So obviously there's a difference between a question and a comment. So we would ask for questions before we roll into the public comment before we end the meeting tonight. So, okay, with that being said, Scott and Jason, if you guys could come up here to possibly be a resource for the questions. And then for those asking questions, if you can go over to the podium. Amy, I think there's a microphone on the ground right there. Because this is being streamed, we want to be respectful of the people listening online. So we'd ask you to talk into the microphone at the podium for any questions. So without further ado, commission members, you're first. If you have any questions of the two gentlemen, you're welcome to it. Yep. And then please introduce yourself prior to asking the question.
Okay, I'm Amy Arthur. One of the questions I had written down was, one of the things brought up at one of the meetings was the city has had some, that's not the one I want to ask. The main one I want to ask is, it was said that city managers will come in and remove union positions and put people into the lowest wage categories possible. So with that being said, with our union contracts, are we protected? Like, that's a big thing, and I think for a lot of workers in Oglesby being union, they want that answered.
Yeah.
The contract is a contract, and we honor contracts, and city managers have no authority to abrogate those contracts. I think that city managers get a bad rap being perceived as being anti-union. I'm not anti-union. I like having representatives of our employee groups able to speak for those employee groups. At the end of the day, the city manager's job, as both Jason and I have said, is to run the city as efficiently and effectively as possible. Sometimes that means asking for some concessions from the union, but we're certainly not anti-union. And furthermore, any agreement that is reached with a union has to be affirmed and voted on by the elected city council.
Yeah, and I'll be clear, yes, your contracts are with the city manager as they go through it. So generally what happens, and again, I'll just be broad the way it works, any kind of union negotiation, that city manager is often going to be the person that they talk through and negotiate through, but it has to be approved by the council. And so there's never going to be a position that the city manager is negotiating some sort of contract outside of the will of what the council's end is. So it is very common, it's normal that city managers work with unions to negotiate those contracts so we have an effective and efficient government. And that's the purpose of having union labor as well.
One additional answer is to say that when I got ready for collective bargaining, my first stop was the city council in an executive session to say, okay, here's the financial condition, here's what I suspect some of the requests are going to be. I may even wait until I actually have some of the union's demands, because I can't be successful at negotiating the contract unless I understand the parameters that my city council, to whom I am accountable, will agree. And then I get my marching orders and try to deliver a union contract that's within those parameters.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, is this on?
No.
Okay, I'm Dave Peters, and I have a question about the city manager costs. So I worked for government for about 15 years, and I know to keep a good city manager, you want to attract one, especially come to a smaller area. What kind of cost is that to the city? And then do you then have to hire additional department heads to go along with that?
Yeah, so I did research into it to look at what are city managers and council manager forms of government Illinois tend to make. You're generally anywhere from 1% to 3% of the overall budget. The larger the budget, the smaller the percentage generally. The two cities that seemed the most comparable, and I don't know these cities, you all might, Village of Palos Park, they have a $15 million budget. Their manager makes $158,000, which is 1% of the budget. And then the Village of Indian Head Park, they've got a $10 million, $9.5 million budget, and their manager's salary is $135,000, which is 1.4% of the budget. I understand you're overall somewhere around 13 to 15 million all in on budget. So you're probably going to look somewhere, and I think you also have, when I looked at your budget, it looks like you have some employees that are over 100,000. So you're probably somewhere in that 120 to 150 range would be my guess, just based looking at comparables. Same size, same type of budget, what you are, that's what you would expect as a salary. Then your question of department heads aren't guaranteed in there, right? So that's part of figuring out how do we run an effective government and efficient government, and where does the budget that the council ends up adopting. The only thing the council manager says is you'll have a city manager, and then you go through on that budget, what are other types of positions and how are those positions structured and what are those costs. So each of those become a budget discussion of what other revenues do we have. Generally what will happen when a form of government changes is the council, the commission is going to say, here's where our tax rate's going to be. We're not raising this tax above this amount. This is where we have to come in at. This is what the expectation is, and that's where city managers have to come in and say, okay, that's the budget, here's where we are. Then you look at, here's programs and services. You want these types of programs and services, you want other new additions to it. That's a budget process and discussion to say, here's what we can do. Here's what we can do in the current budget. Here's what we can do if we have this amount of money, and that becomes a public debate and discussion. So what I can tell you is the salary range, I would guess you to be anywhere on the low end at 100, at the high end of about 150. That would have somebody in here to be able to do that job. Everything else after that becomes a budget discussion. There is no comparable to each city of what else they hire after that.
The only thing I would add to Jason's remarks is that his two comps are from the Chicago metro area, where salaries tend to be a little bit higher, here in downstate to be a little bit lower.
Okay.
I'm Bob Menti from Oaksby, of course. In dealing with customers that I work with over in Streator and Princeton, both of who have the management type government, the comments I'm hearing in both cases from various people is that the management form of government works well as far as continuity of the departments, as has been brought up tonight by you gentlemen. The thing I hear doesn't work well is the fact that the city manager has way too much power overall. It didn't seem like it in your discussions, but this is what I'm hearing from the citizens, few citizens of these two towns.
Is there a question in there, Bob?
I'm just...
Is it,
my
the concern is
this
for
true?
how do you keep the
Is
city
this true?
manager from, gaining too much power? Is that a good?
Well, evidently, yeah, because they're telling me that in both cases, they have a lot of power, which is too much power, they said.
Yeah, and usually, so what I usually hear in that, and I don't know if this is what they're speaking to, is again what I talked about, power versus authority. The power that is there, often what appears is, well, gee, the manager offered the budget recommendation and the council approved it. The manager offered this recommendation, the council just approved it. It will appear as though the city manager is just offering stuff up. Because a lot of times, what's the discussion, what's the dialogue, what is the goals, what are the objectives? Those are all, usually you have a strategic plan that they're operating off of, you have a budget you're operating off of, all those are public discussions. It should be clear where we're moving. The recommendation, how do we get there? That's the authority that you grant to that city manager to say, how do we accomplish this? I want this product, this service, this outcome. How do we get there? And so they're going to offer a recommendation. And often council will say, okay, let's see if that works then. And so they'll often approve it. And so sometimes there'll be things that some people in the community are going to be divided on what they ought to do. They disagree with the council decision. The manager's carrying out the council decision, and then it gets a frustration as the manager. Why is the manager doing this? Well, because the council, that's what they wanted to do as a majority, right? So it will appear as though there's power. What I argue is the reason that it's different is that city manager cannot go off and do what they want. They can't slow play a budget. They adopt a budget, and I'm a manager, I'm like, I don't think we should do that at all, so I'm just not really going to bother. If they do that, they get fired, right? If they actually had the power, they could just do that. They could not listen to the council. If there is a council, and there are places where the council just shows up and doesn't really care, and sometimes they will just be like, yeah, whatever, they're asleep at it, they're not bothering with it. That'd be problematic too, and then it will have the manager simply just carrying forward because the council's not taking action, right? If you elect a council who establishes the goals, the policies, and the priorities, and holds the manager accountable to achieving them, the power's with the council. So that's how I would address them.
I would say, as a city manager of several decades, that I'm accountable to the city council at every step of the way. I once had a job not in the state of Illinois. A local realtor come to me once, and he said, Scott, you have too much power. And what he really meant was that before they had the city manager form, he, as a local realtor, was used to going to selected members of the city council and getting whatever he wanted. In other words, he had self-interest, and he advanced that self-interest through his relationships with council members. And now the city manager was saying, well, this isn't where the majority of the council wants. I mean, it's my job to know what the council wants. And any city manager worth his salt is meeting regularly with his or her elected officials. When I was in Decatur, I met with my mayor at least twice a week, with every council member at least every other week, sometimes more often than that. That was in addition to meetings, because it's the manager's job to be able to distill 5 or 7 or whatever members you have, to distill that into the direction of the city and then to articulate that. So I don't want to overgeneralize. I think that it has been my experience that when somebody thinks that the manager has too much power, it's because they were unsuccessful at advancing their special interest, which was running counter to the general and majority directions given by the city council to the city manager.
Okay, thank you.
I have some questions.
Yeah,
All
go.
the way down there.
Well, yeah, you can just take it.
Right here?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Angie Partridge. My first question, can I ask more than one?
I would say let's limit it to one, so we can turn it over to the public.
Okay. Give me a second here. Okay. Why can we not hire a city manager without changing to this form of, without this going on ballot?
Did everybody hear her question? So I don't need to repeat the question. So there are, in fact, in Illinois, a few, not very many, there are a few commission forms of government that have what are called administrators, where the city commission, the members of the governing body, have adopted an ordinance whereby they, by ordinance, basically reduce their powers as commissioners and delegate them to an administrator by ordinance. It has happened. There are not very many of them, but there are a few examples of it. And that would be, we use the term administrator to differentiate chief administrative officers who have their power delegated to them by action of an ordinance as opposed to a referendum of the people, right? And the latter being a manager. So it has happened, it can be done. The problem with it is that what is done by ordinance can be undone by ordinance. So at the next election, somebody says, well, we have a commission form of government, so by gosh, I'm not gonna abide by the ordinance. The state statute that has designated the city as commission form, that's what it means, and so until it's changed, I'm not gonna recognize the ordinance. And so that has created legal problems for it. So it sort of goes back to something I said at the very beginning. If everybody's all together, everything happens and it gets done. But if you have folks who want to be cantankerous or dysfunctional or be disruptive and obviously acting to ignore an ordinance passed by the city council to delegate some of the statutory powers by ordinance, there is some question as to whether or not it can really be legally binding. Is it really just a gentleman's agreement ordinance with a handshake that's only as strong as our commitment to follow the ordinance? Those are some legal questions that have come up. So it could be done, but that's the weakness of it. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Jim Kleinert. I have a few questions. I'm a numbers guy, all right? And one of the concerns I've heard from the public is you got these people coming from the manager association. They're going to give their side of the story, and they're going to paint the picture their way, all right? So I've done some research on your site, and I'm going to preface this, a couple questions and get to my real question, if that's okay, Scott. So one of your slides showed that the council manager form of government was like 48, 49% in the United States. But what you failed to show on that slide is something I found in another slide doing research, that those numbers neglect villages with a population under 2,500. And in the United States, there's villages that's like 30,000 villages, and your 49% is all of a sudden 7%. So you gotta go through the numbers, right? So, and then on the same website, there's a document that lists all the villages, municipalities in the state that are city manager or city administrator forms of government. And there's not that many of them. There's 170, but they're called the recognized jurisdictions. So what are the recognized jurisdictions that your association uses to create that list?
I believe the International City County Management Association has a criteria because different states have different forms of government. The U.S. Constitution says absolutely nothing about local government because they leave it up to the states, and so there are literally 50 different versions of how local government works in our country. And so what council manager form of government is in Illinois is not necessarily what it is in Georgia or Kentucky or California. And for that reason, the City Management Association has a sort of key attributes of a form of government that if it ticks those boxes, then it's considered a professional form. Most of those originate from a model charter developed by the National Civic League 80 years ago or something like that, that created a model form of government. And to the extent that cities are roughly approximating that, then it's considered then it's considered to be a professional government, whether it has adopted the council manager form in Illinois or not, which would explain why the number of council manager forms in Illinois isn't going to track exactly with the number of cities with professional management. Does that answer the question?
Okay.
Well, I just want to know how they got on the recognized list.
Right,
How did you establish 170?
Yeah. So and I can clarify that for you. So the reason that we keep it, what are those above 2,500? If you look at all the municipalities in the U.S., if you're under 2,500, in a lot of states, they don't have control over what form of government they might be able to adopt. You also, I will tell you unequivocally, if you're under 2,500, there are very few cities that would ever need a city manager. City management is only valuable if you have complexity of the government to actually, there's things we have to manage to understand. Usually what will happen, the biggest number, it'll start at around 5,000 in population as a general population rule. But then you look at also at budget size into that. Many of those 2,500 might have $1 million budget or less, right? So are you going to need to hire, and in some of those, you may have a stop sign as your entire transportation department, right? Like it wouldn't make much sense that we have things to do. So we take out that 2,500 because there's very different opportunities to even change what that form of government might look like in those across the US. So it's not hiding numbers, it's not leaving out, it's to say where there's communities, by and large, we try to look at statistically as a numbers guy and say, okay, where do you have opportunity to determine what form of government might we operate at? That's why we have that number that's placed into there. You're absolutely right. We could talk about every municipality, every type of township, some of which don't even have formalized boards. We can include all of that. That'll dilute all the numbers, and it won't show the story of when a community can choose a form of government, what do they tend to choose? That's what those numbers do. On the recognized government, that is the position, not the government. So in ICCMA, there are city managers, much to the question over here was, can we hire an administrator under a commission form? In many states, yes, you can. And we have many administrators under every form of government: mayor, council, council manager, commission form, town meeting, and representative town meetings. There's city administrators in all of those forms of government. So what they do is to say, if it's a council manager form of government, by default, there's a city manager. The form of government requires that. All the others, they could hire an administrator into another form of government. So those managers say, hey, these are my responsibilities as an administrator. And in my career, I want people to know that I'm doing the same type of work, even though I'm not the council manager of government, I'm doing the same type of work as these people. ICCMA, can you guys take a look at, here's our resolution, here's the job description, here's what my responsibilities are. Would you recognize this job function as city management or city administration? So when you look at that list, you'll see it as council manager form of government, that they're doing this under a council manager form, or you'll see what's called general government, and that general government structure is, it's not council manager, but they're doing a similar type of work. The form of government is different, which changes what some of the ramifications are around it, right? So an administrator under commission has to go to every single commissioner individually and not necessarily operate under a majority unless that commission has agreed we're going to have them operate under majority. Same under mayor council. If you're an administrator, you respond only to the mayor, not to the council. But everything else you do is structured the same. So that's why you'll see those numbers. There's no numbers hiding. You're looking at different things, and we're talking about the percentage. We're looking at those where you can just choose a form of government. What do we see happening? And that's how you see that play out.
Okay, so now I can go ahead and make my point with those numbers. So in the state of Illinois, there are 1,445 municipalities. Throughout the counties, throughout the townships, there's 1,445. In your list, there are only 98 city council manager forms of government. That's 6.8%. That's light years away from 49%, right? And then if you take that down further, of that 98, only 7 of them have populations less than 5,000. So 7 goes into 1,445 times, it's only 0.5%. So again, 0.5%, light years away from 49%. And you made a point, it seems to be more useful for communities more than 5,000, right? Well, the 2,500 that your population you're throwing out, they're a lot closer to us. So I think we have to work harder to make the economics work if we go with the city manager form of government. And I just want to make it clear that, you know, you've got to look at all the numbers, not just above 2,500.
Yeah, totally agree, right? And you look at Illinois is unique in the number of townships that are required to focus on certain structures as well.
Townships are still out.
Okay, so Illinois has a different structure in some of those too. But that, I'm happy to talk to you on data, and we can go through some more of those to make sure we have it right. Yeah.
All right. Commissioner, do you have any more? I do have one myself. As much as we all love paying property taxes, I think one of the concerns with an additional position in the government is the price tag to the taxpayer. You also alluded to, I believe in your presentation, Scott, about the efficiencies created by this position potentially. Can you give examples of what those efficiencies might look like?
Well, there's any number, and I'm sure that Jason could add some of his own. The access to grants or other sorts of financial assistance that the city might not know about through the staff that it already has. Access to joint purchasing arrangements through the state, cooperative arrangements with other governments, online purchasing. Some of them are small in the amount of savings, some of them are large in savings. Every city government that I've served, I believe that the cost of professional management has been more than paid for, several times over by those things, as well as what I call opportunity costs. Sometimes amateur, nothing against folks who are in some of these smaller communities, but they don't have the training or they're part-time and they simply don't know about opportunities for efficiencies or for joint purchasing or for acquiring materials or services that their city needs at a cheaper price from a different vendor. So they stay with contracts that they've always had, even though they might be more costly. And examining all of those things in the long haul has fiscal benefit to the city.
Yeah, and I'll argue also, when it comes to efficiencies, again, just looking at data, if you have a manager who's strong with that financial background, the ability to improve your bond rating reduces costs, right? The ability to look at, from the commission, again, not speaking to Oglesby specific, you all would know that, I wouldn't. When you look at commissioner generally, because you generally have a commissioner who oversees certain departments or agencies, that often will lead to a lack of efficiency because each are focused on their own areas. So in most cities under commission form, there's no need to look holistically to figure out, are we duplicating services? Can we save money in the long run, right? That's not necessarily part of it. It's usually within each department. So a lot of efficiencies often come when you centralize that function to say, how do we operate? Where is there duplicative services? How can we do more with less? Those kind of questions. The other thing is, sometimes communities hire city managers not to simply reduce costs, but also to improve services. So sometimes it's how do we get better services for the same cost that we have. So each community has to decide what is the goal. When you look at, and I'll say this, and it's sort of to the comments you made, whatever form of government you have, I really, it's not my concern in that, right? So I look at each community says, what's the form of government that works for you? You all determine that. I'm just able to say, here's what we see generally that occurs. And so within that discussion is, if we look to change the form of government, the question is always why. I always ask me, what are the goals that you want to accomplish? What are we trying to achieve? What are we not able to do now? Whatever those questions are, how might a city manager do that? If we're looking to save cost, that's easy to hold accountable to. If we're paying this, if this is our budget, this is where we expect to be, how do we get there? And it's easy to hold that accountable. If we start to say we want better services, we want better programs, do we need to invest in different areas? What's our priorities? How do we establish priorities in that? So a lot of the discussion around city managers is around that long-term strategic plan, what are the things we're trying to achieve? And if we do that, will this accomplish those goals? So I always look at it around there. Cost is one aspect, but usually when you start to look at government, eventually you start to say, what am I getting out of my taxes, regardless of the form of government? The question that people often ask is, what am I getting for these taxes? And what do you show me in that? Whether that's savings, whether that's improved services, whether that's something else that you're trying to achieve. But that's usually how we evaluate the manager.
Okay, I think that's it for the commission as far as questions. So at this point in time, we'll open it up to the public for questions. Again, come over to the side, state your name, and then have the question directed at Scott and Jason. If you're more than welcome to come up now and kind of sit in the front row if you do have a question lined up. So go ahead, sir.
Greg Stein, Oglesby here. I got two simple questions that Jim actually touched on the second one. Is this PowerPoint presentation downloadable?
I can send it to whoever needs it, and yes, I can give it to anybody who wants it.
And then I was looking this morning, I was kind of waiting to see if it was going to be presented until this morning. I went and looked myself, asked Google, and then went to the state. Looking for the place to download the villages, towns, and cities, and what form of governments they've got, and populations, and kind of like the tax base in the city. Is that, it sounds like Jim's found it. I came up with 1,300, but they didn't, the website that I found didn't say what I wanted to know. Numbers of population, tax base, and which form of government they got up to 3. And I guess you guys added that there's kind of another combination. And the third question is It sounds like Jim's found it. Pleasure. And could we get that too for Illinois?
I can get you over that.
Okay. And is the manager allowed to converse with the boards? Or does the manager have to go through the council and the council goes through the boards?
You mean like the plan commission or appointed boards and commissions?
Yes. And who appoints the boards and the commissions?
In Illinois, the appointment power for boards and commissions stays the same. It rests with the governing body, and that is not affected by change in form of government. The city commission appoints all those boards and commissions. The city council will appoint all those boards and commissions under the manager form of government as well. Generally speaking, the manager, to discharge his responsibilities as given to him by the city council, travels freely with, not just with staff, but also with boards and commissions, and talks to everybody in order to advance the city council's agenda.
Okay. I know you asked multiple questions. I will ask, moving forward, let we try to limit it to one question, and then if time allows, you're more than welcome to come back up and ask a question. So, okay, sir?
Does that work? Okay, there we go. So the comparison was made between the city manager form of government and like how schools are run. And I, as a teacher myself, as a teacher for, I don't know if I'm in my 6th or 7th year, something like that, I stopped counting. But it is very, very similar, right? A school board obviously is not running the day-to-day, they're not making the day-to-day decisions. They're delegating that or devolving that to a superintendent and then his principals who support him and assistant principals, so forth and so on. And I think that sounds very good if all you're familiar with is Oglesby schools. Because I will say this, I think Oglesby has an impeccable school system, and we've had very consistent administration in our schools. Our superintendent has probably been here, I think he's been here since I was in maybe 7th grade, and I'm 29 years old now, and so that's great. He does a great job. And we've had for the most part, we've had a lot of consistency with our principals as well. The issue is that Oglesby is really an anomaly in that case, truly speaking. In my case, so I've been teaching 6, 7 years, something like that. I've been teaching for that long. I've had 4 superintendents. I've had 3 principals. The administration, the turnover, in smaller communities especially, I work in Serena currently, but the turnover in a lot of these towns, it's very consistent. And so what I worry about, this is my question. As you said, a contract is a contract. And so if we hire a city manager, and I assume we'd probably structure it to be 4 years to go with the council, I assume, I don't know how it works, that's my question. But if we do go that route, and let's say we have issues with the city manager, and we choose to terminate them, are we going to be stuck paying out that contract? Or alternatively, are we going to be stuck in court paying our attorney to try and get us out of that contract? Because I can tell you in my school district's case, a few years ago, we had a principal who was under contract, and this principal, the board no longer wanted there, and it was this long, drawn-out legal issue. And what ultimately happened was the city ultimately decided to settle. Or sorry, not the city, the school district. They ultimately decided to settle. And they paid this principal $160,000 to walk out the door. They paid out the remainder of his contract. He got that, and that was it. He was gone. But we had to pay him out. What I worry about is a situation where we have a city manager who we give the contract to for 4 years, and then especially if they're making $125,000 a year, we're stuck, if the worst case scenario happens, we're stuck paying out $500,000 to somebody for a job that they're no longer doing.
Okay, I think I understand the question is basically, what kind of contract lengths, and then if the city manager is terminated, what kind of implications does the city face?
I use the analogy of the school superintendent of the school district because as a structure of government and the way things happen, it's similar. But when it comes to contracts and compensation, our friends in the superintendent's office have got it a whole lot easier than us city managers do. And that's fine, and that's the way that it should be. The city managers in Illinois, for the most part, don't have the kinds of contracts that you talk about. In fact, most of our agreements, contracts, they're called different things, are indefinite, meaning that they don't have a specific termination date. We serve at the pleasure of the city council, and that can be terminated at any time. So there is no contract to buy out in most cases. I cannot speak to every single employment contract in the state of Illinois. I don't know them, but I can speak for our association, and I would say that the overwhelming majority, the vast majority, are employment agreements that simply say whatever the terms are, and it can be terminated by either party on a reasonable notice. Because as city managers we accept this risk, usually the agreement will have some kind of severance in it, but under Illinois state law, that severance cannot be any more than 5 months' salary. So there really is not, and most of them are less than that. And so there really isn't that much to buy out. So the superintendents have got a better gig, but that's okay because city managers accept this arrangement. Oh, and I would also say that, I mean, there are examples of rapid turnover in city management. There are examples of incredibly long service tenure in city management too. One of my friends recently retired after 40 years as the city administrator in Pontiac. And if any of you know, Pontiac has really gone a long ways in 40 years. The new Justice Center there, all of the Route 66 stuff that they've been able to pull off, and a lot of it's because of the consistency of that form of government there over 40 years. The average life of a city manager in the United States is now about 8 years. When I first got into this business several decades ago, it was about 4 years, so it's doubled in terms of its average tenure. I used to joke that it's 4 years because, you know, to do our jobs properly, we tick off about a quarter of the population every year. So after 4 years, well, there's nobody left. That's a joke, okay? But despite that, the tenure continues to increase. And I think that the reason for that is twofold. Jason might have a different view, that it's going in the right direction, even though, you know, there will be situations where there's turnover in administration in any organization sometimes. But the reason why nationally it's improving, I think, is twofold. The first is that as time goes on, I think that there are local governments that value professional management and the input and the stewardship that it provides over time. The other reason is that oftentimes we're married to professional spouses of our own, and picking up and moving as quickly as maybe we did in the 20th century just simply isn't as possible in our personal lives, and so we tend to stay longer.
And to the question, you do not hire the manager coterminous with the board. That said, if you have a whole new turnover on the board, that whole new board may want to go a different direction, right? But it's not, and then also, you're right to point out, what are the contracts or employment agreements or structure? Because if you change the form of government, you want to be clear, fired by cause versus without cause, what are those so there are times where within that contract language it's there, so you want to just make sure, absolutely, if you change the form of government, one of the things you want to look at is what is that employment agreement or contract or whatever that structure is. Generally what happens, it's just a 1 year cycle. Usually a manager, the norm, some will have a 2 year or whatever. But the norm is every year the city manager has a meeting with the council, they do a performance evaluation, just like most of us do in our jobs, and they say what's working, what's not, what do we need to improve, what do we want to keep doing? And are we gonna hire them on for another year? That's usually the way that works as a norm, and they agree, yep, we're gonna keep them on for another year, they're doing a great job, or we might need to go another direction. That usually happens in that annual review time frame. This is the norm of where that is.
Okay.
Hi. We're good? Okay. Hi, I'm Tom Henson. From WLPO Radio in the newsroom. You gentlemen have done an excellent job, I think, detailing what you came here to detail, giving us all the benefits in your advocating for a council manager form. What, though, I'm wondering if we could take just a quick step back. I mean, what, as credentialed, experienced people, can you offer us some examples of why the current form of government would be preferable for a city like Oglesby? I mean, we're hearing why council manager would be good, but if these people were considering why the benefits of the current form, assuming everybody's operating properly and everybody's getting along, what are the benefits of it?
Yeah. So the reason commission form came up to begin with was when they had separate powers, the mayor was ineffective in getting stuff done right away. And so they said, let's just streamline this, and each person will be responsible for certain departments, no deliberative process goes away, we can get stuff done quick. I know exactly which commissioner I need to go to for my department, don't need to worry about any other commissioner.
Okay.
So that was why it came up quickly. The reason it faded quickly, and this is where I always go back to the research part of it, is why did it not stick? Why wasn't that the thing that everyone wanted? Was because while that's great, what happens when I don't have the connection with this commissioner? I got a good connection with this commissioner, but this one I do not.
So it's faster,
That's
not
the
necessarily efficient. It's faster, but
Correct.
not necessarily efficient. Okay.
And so that's the advantage of it, is you don't need to deliberate about what to do in each department.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Hi, my name is Michelle. My question is, if the city manager form of government is voted in, what happens next? And what cost is incurred to convert the form of government from commissioner to city manager? Because some research says that that could be upwards to $350,000 to $1 million to convert the form of government.
I'll address and you can jump in. So I'm not sure what your numbers are, and I haven't looked at what your numbers are that's there. The things that you've got to consider, if we change to a form of government from one to another, any kind of form of government changes. One is, what are obviously the salaries, benefits of any new positions that are created? The only positions that necessarily is created is the city manager position. Then you look at, from the budget perspective, is where most of that then starts to come into play. Some communities will do a lot of research to look at what are all the other positions, how far have we streamed this out, what are other downstream costs. Those will be very community specific, but what you'll need to do is you'll have the state code stipulates what needs to be in place, and so that gets put into place. And then after that, it's kind of up to the cities to say, what are the things that we want to add to this, take away from this, what are the streamline opportunities? Usually what happens is city manager gets hired, and then in that first year, the budget process with that council, what are all of the areas where we're going to see this budget lay out? Here's our goals, here's our objectives, how do we do that? There may be other costs in some places, there may be savings in other places, and so there's no formula that says it's going to cost this amount, we're going to save this amount. I've seen them where people pay a lot more right at the start of it. I've seen some where they save money right at the start of it. So it becomes a lot of the budget discussion as you lay out of what's the actual cost end up being. And I've seen communities that are way off, plus and minus, right? So someone will tell you it's going to cost this amount. It's not until you get into the work that you actually find out what it is. So all of it is going to be guessing. Just nationally, when you see changes of form of government, whatever that change is from one form to another, it's always a guess until the budget plays out.
I don't have a working knowledge of Oglesby city government, so I can't speak to that, but I would think that that number that you mentioned is way out of proportion to what it is likely to be given the size of the city and the size of the city's budget. Last November, the city of Mattoon, Illinois they had a referendum to go from commission form to council manager form, and it was approved by the citizens. And so now, one of the other senior advisors in the Illinois City Management Association and I are working with the city of Mattoon to work through some of the exact things that you've asked about. The first thing that the city has to do, the city council has to do, is adopt an ordinance. And in addition to the preparation of the ordinance, there's likely to be some other minor changes in some other ordinances that might have to be updated to reflect the form, maybe even certain forms or other paperwork that the city uses. There's going to be some legal costs associated with that. But based on the work that I've done there in Mattoon and other places, I really don't believe that there's going to be significant costs beyond the salary and benefits cost of the person who's hired. So that tells me that the number that you mentioned is, I don't know where that comes from, and I'd be extremely surprised that it was that high.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I do want to allow time for public comment, so I will probably ask this to be the last question.
I'll try and make it the best one. Not really. First of all, thank you for putting this meeting together tonight, and I appreciate it. I think you did an excellent job of the presentation. And actually, the previous questioner addressed much of it. My question had to do with the transition. What does this look like, and what types of things have to be done to make this become a reality, and how long does it take? So you addressed some of those things. But one of the things I wondered was about, is there a requirement that city councils, that the members of councils be elected all at the same time, or can they be staggered terms, and is that something that is advisable to do at the same time that there's a transition to a new form of government? I just didn't know what laws govern that. Thank you.
So under the commission form of government, unlike the aldermanic form and unlike the council manager form, commissioners are all elected at the same time for 4 years, for 4-year terms. So the entire, as you know, because that's the way it's been in Oglesby for many, many years. So the entire commission is up all at once, so they can be all reelected or all wiped out at the same election. Generally speaking, regardless of the form of government, that's not been considered to be a good thing. You want to have more continuity of government. You want to have staggered terms. Under the Illinois statutes, staggered terms are simply not a feature of commission form of government. So it is for council manager form of government. And for that reason, for other reasons too, the statutes require that if the council manager form of government is approved by the citizens at referendum, the city council then enacts the ordinance. But at the next, and technically they're operating under council manager form once they adopt the ordinance. But to then get the governing body portion of the form of government set up at the next election, all of the members of council would run, and the top 2 vote getters would get 4-year terms. The 3rd and 4th position in total votes would get 2-year terms. And then after 2 years, those people would run for 4-year terms, so that every 2 years, 2 of them are coming up, and then the mayor is on one of those cycles as well. So that you have, so that's how you get staggered terms. But under the Illinois Consolidated Election Law, you don't have that many opportunities for elections, and so you have to wait for the next one to come up to fully affect that. So in summary, I would say almost all of the changes that you need to make can be done, in the first 3 months or so after the referendum. But getting the council on the staggered terms that are a feature of both council manager and strong mayor aldermanic will take longer just because of the consolidated election law. Does that answer the question?
It does, thank you.
And I'll just add to the question of, are there benefits to one or another? So everything, and I'll keep coming back, what makes sense for each community. So the question becomes, when you have everyone all at once, there's greater voter turnout all at once for that whole election. Everyone knows what moves there. And you have continuity for those 4 years. The downside is, if you wipe out that whole board the next time, the continuity goes away. So some people like staggered to always have continuity. The downside is every 2 years you're running through elections, and sometimes there's election overload. So really it becomes, what do you feel is the best interest of the community? Because you'll see them work in any way. And with any of these, whether it's commissioner, council manager form of government, whether it's staggered terms or not, if you move to the council manager, all of those become legitimate questions that there's advantages and benefits that you got to weigh on what those are.
One follow-up question to that. So say this referendum moved forward, when is the effective date? Is it, election's Tuesday, is it Wednesday? Or how does that work?
The attorney may be better able to answer that question than I am. Of course, the election has to be certified by the LaSalle County clerk, but I believe that generally speaking, it's not into effect until the council then certification, adopts the city manager ordinance, which is fairly boilerplate. It's really pretty much, there is some discretion, but for the most part, it has to reflect what's in state statute. And that there's not, I don't believe, Pat, that there's a deadline that they have to act on that ordinance within X number of weeks or months. There is
not, but it
Yeah.
clearly has to go into effect at the next election cycle.
Right.
And to answer your question, Dan, to make it clear, in case people got lost in that conversation, if you stay with the commission form of government, the commissioners are elected every 4 years. If you elect the manager form of government, you have no choice. The terms are going to be staggered based upon the highest vote getters and the lowest vote getters at the next election. And in this case, that will be in April of 2027. So all of this could be delayed until that law.
Okay, so at this point, I want to get Jason and Scott off the hot seat and show a round of appreciation for them. Thank you both. All right, so if we're going to stick to the 2-hour meeting schedule here and respect everybody's time, I'll open things up for public comment at this time. I would ask everybody to be respectful of the 2 minutes. And just for fairness, how I'm going to do this, I'm going to keep I got a timer on the computer up here. What I'll do is I'll strike the gavel once at the 2-minute time limit, and then I would ask you to wrap up right there or soon thereafter. Okay? Opening the floor up. Again, if you would come over to the podium to speak. Quiet crowd. All right. I was not expecting that. All right. So at this point, okay. Again, state your name, please, before you comment.
I hate to be that kid in class that keeps raising his hand and chiming in, especially, people want to leave. But I just wanted to say one thing, and it was something that was articulated by the 2 presenters tonight as well, is that it's the people who make up the form of government that really matter the most. And so you can mitigate, perhaps, with the city manager form of government, some of the issues, maybe, that you would have with the commission form of government if you don't have the most ideal people in office. But at the end of the day, a city manager form of government, if it doesn't have good people, and if there are not good council members running that city manager form of government, it is still ultimately going to not necessarily be a good government. And so a picture I want to paint maybe for people who support this referendum is simply this. Okay, this is a hypothetical. Just imagine we adopt this new form of government, and imagine that the composition of the next council is exactly the same. You have exactly the same members on that city council as you do now, but now you have a city manager. Does anybody think that the issues that we have, the headlines that we make, the chaos that unfolds because of name calling, because of just petty bickering, do we really think that's going to go away? It's not. It's simply not. So even if we can mitigate some of the issues with the city manager form of government, ultimately the impetus is on the people of Oglesby to vote for better candidates. And so that would really be my recommendation. I would obviously say I'm against this proposal and urge people to vote against it, but I respect your opinion if you disagree. So, thank you.
All right. Before I entertain a motion to adjourn, I do want to encourage anybody that doesn't feel comfortable standing up in front of the crowd and asking a question, or if after you get more information or do a little bit more research and have a question, feel free to drop those off at City Hall. What the commission will do is we'll consider whether another one of these meetings will be useful, and if there's speakers that we want to present more information, and then we will advertise that as such. So at that point in time, I will entertain a motion to adjourn. It's been moved. Second? Second? All in favor? Aye. It passes. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.